If you are armed and are at Glenmont Metro Station, please shoot me. Shoot directly into the head, in the temple, slightly downward. It needs the bullet to follow the shortest path through my brain to the hippocampus. If I'm lucky, I'll feel the bullet tearing through my brain. Just a few decades. I know it sounds horrible, but by doing this, you will be doing me a huge favor. Dying from a gunshot as quickly as possible is the best thing that can happen to me right now. Vitriol began about 10,000 years ago. At 10:15 this morning, I make extra money participating in clinical drug trials. I'm a so-called subject who takes untested drugs so that doctors can study side effects. Once it was a kidney medicine, a few times something for blood pressure or cholesterol reduction. This morning, I was told that the drug I took is some kind of nootropic, enhancing brain function. Throughout all this time, I've never felt any effect from these drugs. In other words, none of the medications they tested on me ever kicked in, relaxed me, or did anything at all. Maybe I always ended up in the placebo group. But either way, I felt nothing. Today was different. This crap worked. I took a pill at 10:15, and then I was asked to wait in the reception until they called me for some tests. Only 30 minutes, said the lab assistant. I settled on the couch in the waiting room and flipped through a couple of articles in Psychology Today from the coffee table. They didn't invite me back to the office, so after finishing that magazine, I grabbed US News and read it cover to cover. Then I read an old issue of Scientific American. What were they doing in there for so long? I lazily glanced at the wall clock. It was only 10:23. I managed to read all 3 magazines in 8 minutes. I remember thinking back then that this day would be long. I was right. There was a small shelf with old books in the waiting room. When I stood up to approach it, it felt like my legs were barely working. Not that they became weak, but as if they became slow. I stood up from the couch for a whole minute, and then spent another 2 minutes walking to the shelf, even though it was only 2 steps away. Of all the books on the shelf, I chose a volume of Moby Dick. I had the same problem with my hands as with my legs. It took me an eternity to reach for the book, and I even got bored waiting for my hand to touch its cover. I dragged myself back to the couch and collapsed on it, as if in slow motion. It reminded me of the astronauts' jumps on the moon in low gravity. There, I opened Moby Dick and started reading from the phrase "Call me Ishmael." I managed to get to the point where Ahab throws his pipe into the sea when they called me for tests. The lab assistant asked me,
"How do you feel?"
Slowly.
Actually, it's the opposite. It seems to you that the world around you is slow because you are fast.
But what about my legs, my arms? Everything seems to be in slow motion.
It seems to you that your body is moving slowly because your brain is working much faster. Right now, it's operating at 10 minutes 20 times the usual speed, so you think and process incoming signals with acceleration. Despite this, the movements of your body are limited by the laws of biomechanics. In fact, you move faster than the average person.
The lab assistant mimicked a running person.
But your brain is so far ahead of your actions that even your acceleration seems very slow to you.
I thought about my slow fall onto the couch. Even if my muscles were working slowly, I would still be subject to the laws of gravity, but I was falling slowly. Sluggish muscles couldn't explain why gravity seemed weaker. My brain was working 10 times more actively. That's why I read 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. I underwent several tests. It was especially fun to take the physical ones. I juggled 3 balls, then 4, and then 6. It was easy because all 6 balls moved very slowly. In fact, it was even boring. I had to wait for each ball to follow its trajectory, then slowly put my hand underneath it and toss it again. They tossed corn rings into the air, and I caught them with chopsticks. They also scattered a handful of coins, and I calculated the total amount before they touched the ground. The cognitive tests were no longer as fun but more informative. Find a word in a text of 50. Navigate a convoluted labyrinth on an A1 sheet. Provide detailed answers to questions about a presentation shown to me at a speed of 10 pictures per second. I was told that I scored over 250 on the KNOP scale. This exceeds any human result. Then they sent me home. They told me that the effects of the drug would wear off in about 2 hours. It will seem to you that several days have passed. Try to use this to your advantage. Answer work emails while you're in fast-forward mode. The trip home was just awful. Only 3 subway stations, which normally took about 35 minutes, but in my new accelerated reality, it took several days. Several days. I spent about an hour just walking from the office to the elevator. Even though I ran as fast as I could, the laws of biomechanics were stronger than me. I couldn't make my legs move at the speed corresponding to the pace of my brain. Such a disconnect between body and mind prevented me from accurately assessing my body's position in space and, consequently, reacting to the environment. Essentially, I became an unwieldy giant. I miscalculated my speed and collided with the elevator wall with all my strength. Even though I saw the wall at a distance from me, I couldn't stop and pull my finger away from the elevator button in time, so I pushed it too hard. Too hard. It hurt a lot. If my brain were working normally, I would have felt pain for about 30 seconds, but in my state, it lasted 30 minutes, 40 minutes. The elevator ride was disgusting. For about 4 or 5 hours, I descended 7 floors, scrutinizing the elevator walls. I reached the subway. Honestly, it was even fun. Despite moving super slowly for me, I could still choose where to put my feet, how to move my arms, and how to turn. After 2 blocks, I adapted to this imbalance between mind and body, and then I danced my way to the subway, maneuvering between people on the sidewalk and dodging passing cars with only a few inches of clearance. For about an hour, I descended an escalator, ran along the platform, and then incredibly got bored for all 6 minutes while waiting for my train. Of course, unlike the elevator, there was something to look at here, but I got bored with it. I should have brought that volume of Moby Dick with me. My train roared into the station. The usual screeching of the subway brakes, quite high, in my high-speed perception turned into a long, low sound, something like a monotonous tuba solo, 3 octaves lower. Not only the screech of the subway train brakes sounded in my perceived frequency range, but also all other sounds, almost on the verge of inaudibility. I couldn't hear voices. They became much lower in the perceived frequency range. I managed to hear a child crying in the subway car. Her cries slowed down so much that they reminded me of whale songs. Other sharp sounds like car horns or the rattling of trucks passing over bumps became dull rolls of distant thunder. Even at the research center, I could talk to employees and hear them clearly. But now it became impossible. The effect of the drug only intensified. In this damn train, I spent several days, listening to the whale-like songs of a screaming baby and the tuba solo of the brakes. Despite the fact that voices went out of the range of frequencies I could perceive, I still smelled scents the same way as before. I could perfectly sense the scent of bodies, the stench of the train brakes, the aroma of flatulence, and other wonderful smells in the subway car. Finally, I reached my apartment. Sprinting from the doorway to the large room at full speed felt like a slow descent down the waters of a lazy river. I was so glad to finally be home. At the very least, there was something to do here. I grabbed 100 Years of Solitude, which I had recently started, and finished it. I flipped through the pages so quickly that I tore some of them, but despite such speed, I still flipped more than I actually read. 3 minutes had passed since my return. Then I was glued to the internet. But the internet was annoyingly slow. A new page took about an hour to load, and it only took me a fraction of a second to read it. Hundreds of articles from the feed read, and another 3 minutes. In total, I started reading books from my must-read list and finished 2. Another 4 minutes had passed. Maybe if I sleep, the effects of the drug will wear off. Unfortunately, the part of the brain responsible for perception, accelerated by the drug, was not responsible for sleep. Despite not sleeping for several days, my body still thought it was 1:25 in the afternoon, and it didn't want to sleep. Despite this, I tried to force myself to sleep. I went to the bedroom and threw myself on the bed, closed my eyes, and lay for hours until I gave up. Sleep didn't come. Everything pointed to the fact that for several days, or even weeks, I would be confined to this slowed-down prison. So, I took zolpidem. The sensation of the pill and the water with which I washed it down moving inside my throat made me nauseous. A lump hindering my breath, like a snail crawling down my esophagus. I read a book. 10 minutes had passed. Read a second one. 18 minutes since taking zolpidem. In rage, I threw the book across the room. It sailed slowly and gracefully through the air, like a leaf in the wind, and crashed into the wall with a barely audible long rumble. This was the first sound I heard, seemingly in hours, and then slid to the floor, sinking like a flip-flop in water. Gravity clearly hadn't changed since morning. The laws of physics remained the same. Only my perception of time had gone mad, which meant I could measure the effect of the drug based on the speed of falling objects. Given how long the book glided to the floor, I understood the effect of the drug was still intensifying. I read a magazine, turned on the television, disappointedly scrutinized each frame of the video sequence like a slideshow, turned off the television. Read a bit more. I read the first 2 volumes of Churchill's A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Not exactly light reading. Actually, it was disgusting to read. But considering that taking another book from the shelf would take several unbearably boring hours, just sitting and reading Churchill was better. Well, or at least not much worse. 35 minutes had passed since taking zolpidem. I lay down on the couch, closing my eyes. Time passed. Inhale, hour-long process. Time passed. Exhale, another few hours. I couldn't sleep. A new plan was needed. I decided to go back to the research center where they gave me this medicine. Maybe they have something that can counteract such a side effect. Well, or some sleeping pills so that I could just sleep through the entire time until the effect wears off. I left the apartment as quickly as I could, several hours by my feelings, and didn't even bother to close the door. It would take too much time. Down the stairs, through the vestibule, and finally outside. Like a long day at the office. Down the street, maneuvering between pedestrians. Probably. They thought I moved with inhuman agility. The first flight of stairs leading down to the subway. Stair landing. Towards the second flight. And that's when Zolpidem kicked in. I didn't feel like sleeping. Not at all. On the contrary, perhaps the action of Zolpidem mixed with the action of that experimental drug I took in the morning. I ran down the stairs, moving in slow motion but still feeling the motion. And then, bam, everything stopped. Boring hum of the street. The subway noise disappeared. I was surrounded by perfect silence, unlike anything I had ever heard. Before the action of Zolpidem, my sense of time had slowed down, probably by a factor of 100, and after, by thousands. Each second felt like days. Even the movement of my eyes, any attempt to shift my gaze, felt like a slow glide across the field of vision. Throughout the day, I learned to walk, run, and jump, considering that my brain was working hundreds of times faster than my body, but after the slowdown Zolpidem caused, control over my body became almost impossible. I fell down the stairs. Despite freezing in the middle of a step, I absolutely could not control my muscles. Mentally, I commanded my leg to move forward. It took hours, and then back, if it seemed to me that I might miss the next step. Hours were spent adjusting how much my ankle was bent, and hours bending it differently if it didn't work the first time. Despite all my efforts, I twisted my ankle on the next step. The slowdown didn't alleviate the pain at all. Several hours of continuous pain in the sprained leg. There must be something different about the nerve signals of pain that reach the brain. They don't work like the nerves in the ears. Sound stretched over time, decreasing to the point of being impossible to perceive. But the pain did not change over time. Many hours of increasing pressure on the sprained leg as I shifted my weight onto it. Hours of growing pain. I stumbled forward, unable to control my slow body. Entire days passed as I slid down, trying to turn my torso to avoid hitting my head on the ground. I succeeded. I hit my shoulder. At first, I didn't even feel the impact. But the pressure grew, as did the pain. Hour by hour, the shoulder couldn't withstand it and dislocated in one endless jerk. Several days later, I stopped, curled up on the ground, and stared at the floor. The shoulder still hurt as much as at the moment of impact. I had enough time to think about everything in the world during this fall. If every second felt like a day, every real-time minute took years. Even if the drug wears off in 2 to 3 hours, for me, this nightmare would last for centuries. By the time I fell to the ground, I had a plan. I needed to get to the platform and throw myself under the train. I tried to get on all fours, but I underestimated the force needed to turn, and I rolled onto my back. The shoulder had been hurting for several days and begged for mercy. The second attempt, I fell face down, trying to understand how to control a body that moves slower than grass grows. Several weeks of futile attempts, and I finally managed to get on my knees. If getting on all fours was such a struggle, undoubtedly walking or running would be impossible for me. So I crawled. I crawled through the subway station, watching perplexed people around me for weeks, crawling under the turnstile and onto the escalator. The escalator during rush hour moved at the speed of a glacier sliding into the sea. As I descended, I observed the platform crowded with people. On the sign tracking train movements, it said the next train would arrive in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, a whole year for me. I would have to linger on the subway platform for an entire year, awaiting death. I slid down the escalator, scrutinizing the concerned faces of office workers for several days. I managed to crawl to a bench and curl up next to it, trying to find a position that wouldn't disturb my injured shoulder. But the situation worsened as much as possible. The slowdown on the stairs was just the beginning of the interaction between the experimental drug and Zolpidem. And now, they began to interact in full force. I blinked, and years of darkness followed. I already had no hearing, but blinking, I also lost sight. Years of absolute darkness and silence filled only with the pain in my damaged shoulder. My accelerated brain filled the void of sensory deprivation as best it could. Voices spoke to me. They sang in non-existent languages. Patterns, faces, colors flickered before my closed eyes. I remembered my entire life and invented another one for myself. I forgot English. I fell into despair. I prayed to God. I became God. I created a new universe in my imagination and brought it to life. And so again. And again and again, the eyes opened with the sluggishness of tectonic plates. Weeks, a faint flicker. Weeks, a glimmer of light. Weeks, a narrow slit through which I could see the subway platform. Passengers' ankles not far from me and an announcement on the opposite wall. I took out my phone from my pocket, an action that took decades. How can I describe this unbearable boredom? Even the pain in the shoulder won't compare to it. I had thought every thought that could come to my mind more than once. The announcement on the opposite wall remained unchanged, and the people's ankles didn't move at all. The boredom was so saturated that it felt touchable, as if stone and metal rings were squeezing my brain. There was no escaping it. What could I do? If I throw myself off the platform without waiting for a train to run me over, I won't die. I will experience endless pain, stronger than falling down the stairs, but most likely, someone kind will save me before the train arrives, and I won't be able to do anything when the train actually appears. My suffering will be endless, so I have to wait for the train to throw myself directly under it. When it hits me, I will feel myself being torn apart for centuries before I die, and all of this will finally end. I've lived hundreds of lives at this bench. My soul is much older than any person who has ever lived on Earth. Most of my life is flashes of pain in a dislocated shoulder, lying on the subway platform, and observing the same announcements in someone's legs. This post is my plan B, my final prayer, my adventure. I've spent several lives typing this post, hoping that someone will read it and realize that my suffering needs to stop. Someone who is on this platform right now. Someone who will find the man lying near the bench, who recently crawled down the escalator. Someone who will kill this man as quickly as possible. A gunshot to the temple. If you are armed and at the Glenmont subway station, shoot me.